Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Clinton Presidential Center. My name is Stephanie Street, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Clinton Foundation. And on behalf of all of our staff and our volunteers here, we want to just welcome you to this really exceptional program this evening. I want to thank you for joining us as we honor Pride Month. And I'm using the word honor instead of celebrate because the LGBTQ population has been under relentless scrutiny and attack. And while we do celebrate the progress, Pride Month has become a call to advocacy and action. Tonight's program is presented by the Clinton Foundation, the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum, and the Central Arkansas Library System. So happy to see our friend Nate Coulter here. Welcome. Obviously my colleague and my great friend, Dr. Jay Barth. And we have some very special guests here as well. I also want to give a special shout out to our loyal and generous supporters who make these kinds of programs possible. And without them, we would not be able to have the very diverse selection of programs and offerings that we have here literally every day, every week at the Clinton Presidential Center. So I'd like to start by introducing our panelists this evening. First, Dr. Gwendolyn Paige Herzig, who has spent all of her life and career in Arkansas. In 2019, she purchased Park West Pharmacy, located in Little Rock, realizing a lifelong dream of community pharmacy ownership. She is an active clinical pharmacist, focusing on transgender care and affirming care for the LGBTQ+ community. Herzig is a proud advocate for disadvantaged communities and looks to provide closure and gaps of care and resources for those affected by such. Dr. Mauree Turner is the current representative for Oklahoma's 88th House District and a queer, non-binary Okie Muslim. As the first Muslim elected in Oklahoma and the first non-binary person elected to a state-level position in U.S. history, they understand why equitable and accurate representation matters. They have championed legislation for accurate and equitable documentation for our community members who live beyond the binary. Chase Strangio is Deputy Director for Transgender Justice with the ACLU's LGBT and HIV project and a nationally recognized expert on transgender rights. Chase's work includes impact litigation as well as legislative and administration advocacy on behalf of LGBTQ people and people living with HIV across the United States. Chase is a graduate of Northeastern University of Law and Grinnell College, and he will be joining us virtually on the screen right there. All right. And what I've said to you are just literally a few highlights from the impressive resumes of our speakers tonight. And as I mentioned, our moderator for tonight is Dr. Jay Barth, the director of the Clinton Presidential Library and Museum, my wonderful colleague and partner in crime, as I like to call him, and again, our friend Nate Coulter, the executive director of the Central Arkansas Library System, is here with us and one of our program partners this evening, and he'll make some closing remarks at the end of our program. So without further ado, I will ask you to please silence your cell phones and we'll get the conversation started. So Jay, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you all for being here on a warm evening. We'll try to keep the AC as low as possible to give you a pleasant evening here. I am thrilled that our panelists are with us tonight. Representative Turner drove a long way, and Dr. Herzig drove a shorter way, and Chase, of course, we're thrilled that you are here as well. So you heard from Stephanie the basic bio, your basic bios, everybody knows that. But I would like to hear, in your own words, your own pathways to being a political leader, a healthcare professional, a legal advocate, and the way, with an eye to the role that gender affirmation played in that pathway. And Chase, you want to get us started? Oops, I think we're muted. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So there's a little bit of a delay and a little bit of an echo, but we're gonna roll with it. So hi, good to see you. Thank you for having me virtually. I wish I could have been there with all of you. Yeah, I mean, I feel like my pathway was a winding one in some respects. I didn't have a clear sense of where I wanted my advocacy to go, and I didn't even know necessarily that I wanted to be an advocate. And in many ways, that was a product of feeling as a young person like I had no idea how to be myself. There weren't models available to me. I grew up in the 90s before the internet was available to me, so I had little sense of what it would mean to be a fully embodied person. And I think as human beings, when we can't sort of conceptualize the sense of possibility for us, whether that's because of a lack of representation, whether that's because of structural barriers to participation in vital institutions like education or others, that it's harder to manifest and imagine what we are going to find in our lives. And so through a lot of years of struggle, I found my way to college and then to law school. Recognizing myself as a trans person and understanding some of the ways in which the law was limited and problematic, and wanting to use my access and proximity to it to disrupt some of those violent and problematic histories of our US legal system. I found my way into the advocacy space that I've been in now for the last 15 years. And one of the things that I talk about often is there is no universe in which I could be litigating cases across the country. I could be arguing cases in Little Rock, Arkansas on behalf of trans communities if I had never had access to gender affirmation and gender affirming medical care. It was my pathway, it was my lifeline, and it is the reason why I'm here today able to do the work that I do.
Great. We're thrilled you're here, Chase. Dr. Herzig, you want to go next?
No, for sure. So I started transitioning 3 years ago, back in 2020. And when I decided to pull the trigger on it and really take a close look about like where my pathway and where my goals and whatnot were begun, it was really shrouded in like a thick fog and mystery. I'm a healthcare professional and I feel like I can't figure out where's my HRT provider, what HRT is reasonable, what are my T blockers, what levels of estrogen should I be on? Is progesterone really, should I be taking that? And so on and so forth. And like, what are my surgical consults? What are the surgical options? I mean, the list goes on and on. And I'm like, I'm having to do some like deep Reddit searches for this. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. I should not have to do that. And so really at the beginning, I really had not planned to be like an advocate at all until I got to the point where I'm like, I need to pave a path forward for people. And so that's really what we've done. In Arkansas, I have to feel like we have really paved a path. Like I know all of our HRT providers. I know what our surgical consults are. We do walk-in injections. I mean, we make sure if someone has a question or a barrier, we're there to like bulldoze it down. And so really, like that's really been my path, is just making sure people have a clearer path than I did. And it seems like it's really working.
Awesome. Thank you. Representative Turner.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Mauree Turner, my pronouns are they, them. I am a representative in Oklahoma's 88th House District, so a little ways away. But so I think a couple of different things. Like when I was growing up, grew up in a 3-bedroom home with like the roof caving in small town Oklahoma, and my mom worked 2 and 3 jobs for as long as I can remember. But one thing that she made sure always happened, right, was like community care, community networking, right? Before I even knew what community organizing was. And so on Sundays when she had it off, she was teaching Sunday school, like my mom Baptist, my dad Muslim, and they raised us with principles from both. And so like community care has always been very deeply woven into who I am and how I got to be here. And if I was missing school in elementary school, it was likely because, well, 1, we couldn't afford childcare, and 2, my mom worked for state health department. So some of the big things that I remember going to as a child were HIV and AIDS awareness conferences and LGBT, like back then, like LGBT community listening sessions, things like that, PFLAG, stuff like that. Because like this was a time where the AIDS epidemic was happening and my mom was trying to figure out how to take care of our community. Oklahoma is like like in top 7 in the nation for late testers and like in rural Oklahoma, like late testers, HIV and AIDS transmission, things like that. And so like that, my very first book I took to show and tell in first grade was My Grandmother Has AIDS, like, which was a really good book on destigmatizing the fact that like not just men, like Black women also have AIDS at a high rate, right? And like we should be actively caring for communities, right? Like that's the type of kid I was. But my mom also made sure that we were always at the ballot box with her too. Like that was very, very big for her. That not just anybody gets to be your representation; they have to work for it, right? And we need to know who's on the ballot. And so that was really big too. Fast forward, she made me join student government in high school, and I didn't really know what to do in college. Like I said, small town Oklahoma. I went to Oklahoma State University, go Pokes, to become a veterinarian. And up until about my junior year, that was the big thing. And so, but at this point in time, like throughout those first few years of college, my freshman year, I had only gone to my classes in animal science club and didn't really get out or experience anything. And so after that year was over, I called my mom and I was like, I gave it a shot. I really just don't think college is for me. And she was like, yeah, but like you don't really have a room anymore. So let's give it another shot. So I went back and then I started to think about like the different parts of me that I really care about. And when I was growing up, I was a latchkey kid. So I did a lot of volunteering when I could. The very first thing I did when volunteering was like at the public library. I got to hand out pink lemonade and popcorn on movie days. Like, then that was a dream for me. And so I started to figure out like what were the different volunteering things that I could do on OSU's campus and got involved in those things, which led me to the Council on American Islamic Relations. It led me to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and got to really not only dissect the different parts of my identity, but also bring them together. Because at that point, right, my survival was based on making sure that those parts of myself like didn't connect with one another. But when I was in college, I realized that like the world was so much bigger than what I knew growing up in small town Oklahoma, and that I could be all of those things at once. And so basically, I wanted to figure out how to create in Oklahoma like what my mom created for me, because my mom was the type of mom that created a space where I could come out to her in the second grade, which is what I did. And that's not what we get a lot. So I decided I would dedicate my life to figuring out how to create something like that for Oklahomans. I told myself I would never run for office, but I would always work on a progressive campaign. And that landed me in the Oklahoma legislature. So that is my short story, the abridged version.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing. The American Bar Association has written recently that these developments have brought the movement for LGBTQ rights more rapid success than any other civil rights movement in our nation's history. But this month, the Human Rights Campaign has said LGBTQ plus Americans are living in a state of emergency. The multiplying threats facing millions in our community are not just perceived, they are real, tangible, and dangerous. Who's right? Chase? I think you're muted again.
I think it depends who is being referred to as the LGBTQ community, because it's easy to look at large-scale formal equality wins from the Supreme Court and make assumptions about what's true for the entirety of a community. But the reality, of course, is that just obtaining wins at the Supreme Court, and especially obtaining wins at the Supreme Court on behalf of subsets of a community, does not necessarily translate into the material survival realities of others in the community. I think when it comes to LGBTQ advocacy over the last 20 years, it's really easy to identify ways in which particularly mainstream LGBTQ organizations focus on the needs and visibility of cisgender white couples to the detriment of the rest of our community. After Obergefell was decided, we immediately saw a very swift backlash targeting predominantly trans people and really targeting trans youth that was not prepared for adequately from the organizations that have been pushing marriage equality. Our opponents were extraordinarily agile in shifting their focus from attacking marriage equality to attacking trans people. We were not so agile on the other side. I would say that, you know, I believe and sort of share the concerns highlighted by the Human Rights Campaign, that we're in a state of crisis. I would say, though, that this state of crisis long predates this current moment. Trans people, particularly Black and brown trans people, have been living in a state of crisis for many, many years. We have high rates of violence and discrimination, even where we have formal legal protections. That does not translate into the type of well-being that we want to see in our communities. And I think that's true across many different movements. We can have success at the Supreme Court, whether it be Brown versus Board of Education, whether it be Roe v. Wade, and we see how precarious that is in reality. That leads to Dobbs. That leads to the affirmative action cases today. We have a lot of work to do in building power in communities, because ultimately so many communities are in crisis. And if we're only looking at metrics of success based on big Supreme Court wins, I don't think we're making an adequate measure of how people are living and what their needs are.
Great, thanks. Representative Turner?
I mean, I don't know if I can do anything other than like +1 that, right? Like, I mean, I think about, right, how it realistically, right, it is dangerous to be a part of the many intersections of the 2S LGBTQ+ community, right? But like coming from a deeply red state, right?
To another deeply red state.
Right. When I think about like state of emergencies, like being labeled, right? I think it almost sends a chill through deeply red states on for the 2S LGBTQ+ people who are already there, right? It tells other folks that you can't come here, right? And likely support some of the, like, our folks on the ground, but it also sends a chill through the bodies and the communities that have to live there and say like, oh, okay, like now I am completely untouchable. I feel left alone, right? And so, like, truthfully, I wonder, like, Marsha P. Johnson's quote, right? No liberation for, like, no pride for all of us without liberation for all of us, essentially, right? But how when we don't actually look at the intersections and we only, like Chase is saying, right? Like, and we only get our wins, right, from that surface level work, we will push down on our most vulnerable populations when we're not actively educating ourselves on what is the deep root causes, right? What are we actually trying to do here? And I'm thankful for folks like Trace, right? And everybody up here, right? For being able to take a look at that intersectional work that we need to do, right? Because like, we know that our liberation and equity about how we move around the country is not going to be given to us, right, or ripped away by the Supreme Court of the United States, but it is in community building, right, continuously in community organizing and making sure that we're taking care of the folks next to us, right? So yeah.
Gwen?
+2. But you know, to add to that, it's like every letter of the alphabet has a different like set of like standards that they need to meet for like medical care and whatnot. And obviously it's like the transgender care issue is that, you know, there's a great larger need for medical care for that. And so, yeah, I mean, it is, you know, for the transgender population, having consistent legislation that's coming out and berating you. It's sad when I have to warn clinics and like practitioners that, hey, legislative session's about to start, check in on your patients, make sure their depression screening and their anxiety screening and like treat appropriately. You know, I don't know any other patient population you have to warn about, hey, legislative session. And so it's just, I don't know, that's really sad. But yes, +2, Chase, good job.
So I'm going to ask a set of individual questions now, and then we'll go back to some group questions. But Chase, I'm going to start with you. And first off, I need to start with congratulations on your victory in the Brandt case in the district courts here in Arkansas. And really, what do you envision in the next handful of years as the key moments in the courts for trans and non-binary Americans? What's going to really be the defining few moments that we should expect in the next few years?
Well, I mean, I wish I had more insight into what's exactly going to happen. I think a lot is ultimately unclear and up for grabs, and it's hard to say exactly without knowing what's going to happen in the 2024 elections, which are going to have a huge impact, not just on the nature of our legal rights, the nature of the trajectory of cases into the courts, but also on the contours of democracy, I would say. So there's a lot of unknowns that are hanging in the balance right now. And first and foremost, I guess, looking at the future, looking into the demands that we have as activists, as litigators, as organizers, we simply are in a moment where if we don't show up now, it may be too late. So I just really can't overstress the urgency of the next 18 months of our lives in pushing back against some of the most regressive and authoritarian forces that I've seen in my lifetime, I'll say. In terms of what's happening in the courts and in the contours of trans litigation, we obviously in Arkansas, we have the first full merits win, blocking a gender affirming care ban, holding that it violates the equal protection rights of adolescents and their doctors, it violates the due process rights of parents, and it violates the First Amendment rights of providers as well as patients to receive and give information about where to get gender affirming care. And Judge Moody's decision is already hugely impactful because of the factual findings he was able to make after our 2-week trial. Now we're in a situation where there's this case coming out of Arkansas. We also have 5 other cases where laws have been enjoined preliminarily. And keep in mind, in 2021, it was just Arkansas. We're now at 22 states that have gender affirming care bans of some kind, and those are expanding. So this is gonna move quickly. We will get a circuit split likely quickly. Does that mean it's gonna go up to the Supreme Court in the near term on the question of, do these state laws violate the Constitution? I just don't know. This is all happening alongside, an existing circuit split on the question of does excluding trans students from restrooms in schools violate Title IX in the Equal Protection Clause? There are new contours of attacks on trans and non-binary people in the form of criminal restroom laws for adults, like what we've seen in Florida. Of course, the drag bans that we're seeing across the country, and the expanding nature of curricular restrictions and censorship in the classroom and beyond. All of these things are happening at once. We are doing our best at the ACLU and with our colleague organizations to challenge as many of these laws as we can, while keeping in mind national, big picture strategy, and knowing there are some courts that are eager to affirm these state laws to cut down the rights of trans litigants at every possible turn. So we're fighting a very significant, wide-ranging battle in the courts. But at the end of the day, as I alluded to in the last answer, even if we had a big win in the courts, even if courts were to say these laws are unconstitutional, which would be, even if the Supreme Court were to say that, which would be huge, of course, that doesn't lead to the material change that we need. Just like Roe was a very inadequate baseline, so is the pre-existing landscape of healthcare for trans people a totally inadequate baseline. We started from a position where trans kids were already not participating in sports. Trans people were already not having access to healthcare. Trans people were already scared to or being pushed out of the bathroom. We don't want to return to any of these baselines. We want to push further than that, demand something better. And I just hope that as we're fighting these fights, we don't lose sight of what true liberation looks like.
Great, thanks. So Representative Turner, there are just over 1,000 LGBTQ plus elected officials across the country, according to the Victory Institute's last census. You need about 36,000 more LGBTQ folks in office to have true equitable representation for the community. You're serving as an elected official. So a couple of questions. How much does representation really matter? And how has your time as a legislator kind of changed your perspective on that? And what do you see as the continued barriers for trans and non-binary individuals running for office in particular? Because most of those 1,000, of course, are gay and lesbian and not trans or non-binary.
Because of the type of family I grew up in, like being the first or one of the few, like it was like never something new to me. Like to the respect, like I say this because up until I ran for office, like you share and you kind of like understand that representation matters, but it never really hit me until I ran for office. And that election cycle was like I think, remarkable for me to watch, like for so many reasons. But when I ran for office, I knew I would be the first Muslim that Oklahoma had ever elected in the state legislature. But it wasn't until after I won the general election and other folks started writing articles about the race that I knew I was the first non-binary person elected in US history. I just like assumed that there was someone out there. And I think that was very eye-opening for me. But then, right, like from Facebook to Instagram to Twitter to my email to my voicemail, like those things started to fill up of folks who are younger than me, folks who are older than me, saying like, these are conversations that I wanted to have, right? And then like, particularly in this like sweet spot of like queer Muslims, so many folks, right, were looking at the race and like not even from just like inside Oklahoma, right, but like, and not even from just inside the US, like that was powerful. Folks who will probably never be represented by any form of political party, right, in the US that said like, that reached out to say like, hey, like I heard about your race, like that's really powerful. Like I feel like I can do something now. Because like I grew up small town Oklahoma. My grandmother was the first registered Black nurse in our town and the only one for 15 years. Like, representation, like Miriam Kaba says, like hope is a discipline, and representation aids in creating that discipline of hope, right, to instill, because it is so hard to keep going. And I think everybody up here can attest to it, especially in this last legislative session that we've all experienced, right, that it's hard to keep going, especially if you're the only one. Or if you haven't seen someone try to do something, right, that try to create or fill a need that you have. And so when you see people, right, you get that spark of hope and it drives you to keep going, to say like, oh, okay, like I can and I will be next, right? And particularly, right, the people of House District 88 like not only wrote the playbook on like what's next, they asked the question, they wrote the playbook, and then they walked it, right? Like we ran a deeply grassroots campaign, and I ran to the left of a Democrat, right? Which is something that a lot of folks frown upon. So sorry if you do. But folks understood the importance of the intersectional, right? Our most vulnerable populations, not only just needing allyship in a legislature, right, but being our own representation on so many fronts. Because when you are able to say like, I can represent you and that's fine, right? I know how this place works, right? But when you are disconnected from communities that you are trying to serve, it is so much easier for you to carve them out for the political win at the end of the day. And our communities were consistently being carved out of those big wins, right? Like Oklahoma had one of the largest commutations in US history, and 462 people were let out. This is back when I worked at the ACLU of Oklahoma. But there were supposed to be over 1,000 people that were let out. And so I'm on the campaign trail trying to figure out how to win an election for the first time in my life like this. And I'm getting phone calls from folks that say like, where are my loved ones? They were supposed to come home. Like that was the point of the campaign, right? And like having those conversations, not only with family members, right, but also with the legislature on why we cannot continue to carve people out for a political win now, when like that means that we're willing to sacrifice people. And if we are wanting equitable liberation, right, if we are wanting to see our communities survive where we're at right now, then that means we have to be intentional. We have to say the things out loud, and we have to show folks, because organizing, for me, it saved my life. And honestly, it's probably saved so many lives in here, whether you know it or not, right? Like being able to build power in community is what is going to get us through this, right? And when folks see that someone's fighting for them and folks see themselves, right, in places that they've never seen themselves before, they are more likely to join you. I represent roughly 39,000 people, and we start movements with 2 to 3 people. Like, what does that mean when you are sparking folks who will have never thought about going to a ballot box, right? Or have left the idea of voting for someone behind altogether, right? When you're able to turn out a new electorate because of the deep intentional work in communities, like that's powerful, right? So that's why representation matters. But the hurdles for being here, right, especially if you are one of the first in the few, are big. I'm not going to lie. Like, there are times like where, as being like a Muslim and queer and trans in the Oklahoma legislature, right, like I am the only of so many of these things. It is deeply isolating because the organizing that I have to do against the Republican Party is also some organizing that I have to do for my Democratic colleagues, right, who just don't get it just yet, right, who aren't there just yet, but want to be, you know? And so it's, I think organizing ultimately, right, will break our hearts, but it'll save our lives too. So it's hard.
Thank you. So, Dr. Herzig, as a pharmacist, you're dependent upon other healthcare professionals to make referrals to you and to prescribe the medicines that you administer. And we know that based on a Washington Post investigative report, we know that there's been some organizing to within the medical community to limit access to some of those that evidence-based knowledge. What have you had to face issues in your professional life with other healthcare professionals in not prescribing medicines, et cetera, and bias within that community?
So yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of it's just uneducation too. And so, for instance, there's this scare that low doses of estrogen causes clots. Testosterone can cause clots too, but no one wants to talk about that because it's tea. But estrogen, so forever they didn't want to give proper doses of estrogen to trans women, and it's like, we're just looking for cis female targeted levels, just normal levels. And so I've actually encountered that quite a bit. And a lot of it's just kind of going and educating and making sure like, hey, no, it's like they can tolerate it. It's fine unless they have any other like underlying factors or any like weird genetic abnormalities or any other like case where they could be increased for clotting. But a lot of it's just uneducation. A lot of my stance recently has been like switching over to like training pre-professionals and professionals about what proper HRT is, progesterone, what the role it really plays and what other roles it plays. A lot of people think like, let's just talk about progesterone for breast growth, but actually progesterone has a couple of other uses that are actually pretty vital. We talk about testosterone and like the different dosage forms it comes in, whether we want to talk about T-gel or testosterone cypionate injections and what our doses are, and really kind of educating people on like, even patients. It's like HRT is kind of it's an all or none. It's like you don't get to choose what you want from it because you're going to get all of it. So and so it really is kind of going with that. As for bias and stuff like that, I generally, the practitioners who just don't want to prescribe it. I mean, I've seen family care practitioners who are like, it's easy for them to prescribe tea for gentlemen who are older with low T. But when I send them a trans man over and it's like, hey, he's been on this, and like he's a steady patient. He's been on this for like 10 years now. He has a steady dose. He like fully passes and everything. And he just wouldn't have said anything in his like thing, they would have never known. But he didn't feel comfortable with that, even though he still prescribes tea for other guys. And so it's just like, it just kind of blows my mind. And, this is a practitioner that I kind of readily trust and like for any other practitioner needs. And so I really kind of blew my mind that he would not do that. And so, a lot of it's just kind of talking, educating, and trying to like really weed that out and what the stigma is, because they really try to force and think that you have to be on HRT. You need to be, even though there's a lot more to transitioning than HRT. Hormone replacement therapy is just a tool that's a long-term tool that can be used to really enhance qualities. But a lot of people are okay with social transitioning. Some people want hormone replacement therapy. Some people want surgical. Everyone's journey is different, and that is a-okay. But we talk about HRT because it is a powerful tool. But that being said, there's a lot of practitioners that think, oh, you have to go see an endocrinologist. You have to see a specialist. I'm like, no, that's silly. Once again, a family practice doctor can prescribe E for, a woman who's like postmenopausal that she doesn't really want to see the symptoms of menopause anymore, or T for low T. It's like, it doesn't require that much. It's not a deep dive into making sure. It's not like advanced diabetes case or a pancreatic disorder or anything like that. And so once again, it's just education. And so I think that, does it cover that question?
Yeah. So I'm going to stick with you, but although I want to get others' feedback on this. You're not only are you a healthcare professional, but you're a small business person as well.
Woot, woot.
And what's that?
Woot, woot.
Indeed. And so my question is, what more could the business community do to move the needle on issues affecting the trans and non-binary community?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. I feel like I am a small business. I own a small pharmacy out of West Little Rock, and I say small, we're pretty decent, but my square footage is like 1,400 square feet. It's not that big. Someone once called me Big Pharma, and I'm like, that's cute. But that being said, and like my small business, my small pharmacy has made such an impact in providing resources, connections, name change clinics. We've done over 200 name and gender changes within the last 2 years. We've provided thousands of dollars of free HRT for those who couldn't afford it, because guess what? HRT has always been looked as a luxury drug. It's like, if you're an old guy, we know you got the money, we can get you your T. Or if it's like you're postmenopausal, you're old, and you want that estrogen, you're going to pay for it. But that's not really so much for the trans community. The trans community looks at this as a lifelong drug and like a very much needed, I'm sorry, there's people over here, a very much like needed thing. And so it should be very much more cost. And actually, for a while, we did HRT at cost. Like, whatever I bought it is what I sold it. Eventually, though, I'm like, guys, I got to make a little money. I got to stay in business. And so we started doing it cost plus $6. But that being said, it's like bigger corporations have a bad habit of just wanting to throw money at a problem. And money, yeah, we appreciate it. And money can do some work if it gets into the right hands. But there's a lot more corporations can be doing to be more present, stand by their values, get out there, do some community shaking, resource connection, making sure their employees or even other people are taken care of in the community. I mean, it's like, once again, a small pharmacy can do so much. I can only imagine what a huge corporation could do if they really wanted to put where their money, where their mouth is.
Great. Representative Turner?
Yeah, I think I don't own a business. I work as a barback in a coffee shop. So when I'm not in the legislature, but I think one of the big things that I have seen in all of this is like, if you are a business owner or if you just like work at a business, like looking at your policies, like a lot of folks are like, oh, like, should we send a letter or something? Like, yeah, probably. But also, right, like, do your policies reflect and care for, right, folks who are in the 2S LGBTQ plus community, right? A lot of that looks like chosen family, right? So your family leave, does that include chosen family, right? Paternity leave, maternity leave, right? Do you have good policies for those, right? Equitable pay, right? We also know that trans folks get paid significantly less, right? And when you think about that, if you are Latinx, Black, right, Indigenous, right, all of these things. So making sure that your hiring practices, right, that you are actually like not just trying to hold the legislature accountable, but also holding yourselves accountable. Because so much of this work is also looking in the mirror a lot too, right? And saying like, okay, where have I aided in harm? And it's hard to name it like that for a lot of us, but like, that's the truth, right? Is that it's harm, and we have to understand that we have aided in it in some way, shape, or form, right? And we have to be okay with that and saying like, okay, and now we're going to be better, right? And so, yeah.
Great. Chase, any thoughts on the role the business community could play on these issues?
I mean, I mean, there's so many things, and I'll just echo and what's been said and add that, you know, I found that, and maybe, you know, others have had this experience too. Lawmakers don't really care if they're passing an unconstitutional law. We can go tell them that their law is unconstitutional, and that's not really much of a deterrent. When large corporations, especially large corporations that employ a lot of people in the state, or that give money to lawmakers, start to push back, whether it's publicly or privately, obviously that has a huge impact. It is way more impactful for corporations to be pushing back against this legislation, to be pressuring lawmakers, than it is for individual advocates to go in and talk about how the legislation is unconstitutional. And then that, is somewhat ridiculous, but that is the reality of the capitalism that we live under. And so there's a huge role for corporations in that. And I think as far as LGBTQ relationships with corporations, the reality is, what's been very clear this year is that, they're very fair weather friends to us overall. And I don't think we want to see any more rainbow, Twitter images without some substance behind it. Really, I think showing up is what is needed in this moment of crisis, and showing up might mean lobbying. It might be, having robust internal policies. It might be doing active recruiting to transform the ability of queer and trans people to get jobs. But right now is the time for corporations to be active, to be brave, and to be aggressive in engaging on these issues.
Great.
Yeah, sorry, just to, I think.
I think he's getting it back on. You're
Okay,
good.
sorry. Just like absolutely some really great examples of that are like, so our gender affirming care ban did eventually pass, but it went through a few different versions, right? And the first couple of versions had insurance clauses attached to it, right? So it was like minors, 18 and under, but also like that you couldn't use insurance, your insurance to help you transition or detransition, whatever you needed to do next, right? Like, and so insurance companies came out and said, like, we're absolutely, like, you're not going to pass this bill. So those versions died. So then the Oklahoma legislature took the insurance clause out and then passed one at the very last minute without it, right? But that's really important, right? And then we saw across the nation, what was that, 2022, 2021, maybe with all, they all blur together now, but when all of the Save Women's Sports bills were going across, right? And we saw the NCAA come out, right? So we have the Women's World Series in Oklahoma. NCAA, we were standing to lose millions of dollars in Oklahoma because of those bans, right? And we got letters from Chambers of Commerce, from NCAA, right? All of these entities that were like, absolutely not, we're not going to do that. Like, we lost out on deals like Panasonic, like billions of dollars from folks saying, like, we're not bringing our company to a state that has actively said that you're willing to have open season on your own community member, right? Like, if it doesn't matter if you're creating a business friendly state, if you have not created a people friendly state for the folks who already live there, right? And so absolutely.
Great. So Representative Turner, you were talking about the power of advocacy earlier, but we know that showing up to school board meetings and legislative sessions on these issues has had a lot of pain and peril. And I think Gwen has a fairly infamous example from her work in Arkansas. Chase, you've seen it all over the country. Could you talk about what we can do to encourage folks to stand up on these issues despite the pains and challenges of being an advocate in some of these settings? I'll start with you, Representative Turner.
For sure. Without like being too jargony, I think like what we're seeing, I guess what we've been seeing right over the past couple of years is like, this is also like what happens, I think a little bit of what happens like when the dog actually catches the car. Like our community, like we see legislatures really doubling down on attacks on community members, right? On life, right? And I think part of that is also because they see the community organizing that is happening, right? They see the strength in communities and they are wondering how to stop that, right? Because from an organizing standpoint, right, when we lift our most vulnerable populations up, when we help our neighbors, right, like everybody gets better. But how a lot of political powerhouses, right, folks who want to maintain political power see it as if we get more than they get less, that we don't all get to benefit, right? And so I think so much of what's happening is because of the power that we're building. And I think I see that, right, with the removals for Justin Pearson and Justin Jones, right? The censure of Representative Zoe Zephyr and myself this year, right, is because like we bring communities with us that have been relegated, right, to places outside of legislatures for so long, right? But the power, the people power that we are building, right, the vocal youth that are showing up, even if they can't vote, right? Like Oklahoma is one of, I think, 12 legislatures in the US that doesn't allow for public comment, right? And folks are showing up and using their voices anyway, right? That is where you see censures happening. But we also know that the communities are fighting to put us back in these places because our voices have been left out for far too long, right? And so for me, right, whenever I see more folks, and they don't even have to be in Oklahoma, right? It could be like the folks who are continuously occupying the legislature in Texas, right? Or even just like a really great grassroots, like mutual aid fund that is like getting so much money, right? Helping so many people do the things that they need, right? Whether that's HRT or transitioning or like surgery, different things like that, or just like getting their groceries taken care of, right? Like those are the things that give me strength to be able to continue to show up, right? And I think that is what happens with my community too, right? Like we are building power and we are building it well beyond the walls of any legislature, right? And we are sustaining ourselves, right? Because we save us, we take care of us. And I just so happen to be in a political seat now, right? But community organizing like that, I'll always go back to that. But I think that happens, right? People continuously show up because communities have built something so wonderful that we get to be a part of. And as long as as long as US government stands, right, we get to be a part of that, right? You don't get to make laws about us without us, right? That's the important part about it. So, yeah.
Great. So Dr. Herzig, are you ready to go back to the legislature in 2025?
That's a great question. And so, yes, probably so. I mean, it's like, you need to show up. Will I be a little bit more defensive? Yes. Was I a little naive walking in there thinking, oh, I can just pour my heart out? These people will like really see just a realistic person, a business owner. Me and my wife have been married for over 10 years, high school sweethearts, 2 kids. But it's like, no, that really didn't make a difference. It really just came down to one question. And so I'm like, yes, no, for sure. I'll probably go back. I'll just be probably a lot more defensive.
Yeah. Good. Chase, what are you seeing around the country, and what are your differing thoughts on advocacy and its power as a result of the last handful of months?
Well, I always believe in advocacy's power. I think obviously the goal is to make us afraid. The goal is to make us feel small. The goal is to make us feel disconnected. And the way, as Representative Turner said, the way to move past that is to create the conditions within community that people feel safe and empowered, and to not let the state, to not let the extra legal organizations that are enacting violence win and control the contours of our advocacy, of our freedom, of our dreams. I think about in Arkansas in 2021, we had 4 families and 2 medical providers that were willing to, under their name, come forward and sue the government and set that precedent over these gender affirming care bans. And it is admittedly a lot harder now. There are not people who are moving forward with litigation under their names. People are extraordinarily scared. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think one of the most beautiful examples of organizing that I've seen is in Arkansas, with the coalitions in Arkansas that have shown up, the way that Intransitive holds space for community in Arkansas and organizes people outside to always center joy, to always center trans and queer lineages. That is, I think, the way that we ensure that we continue to show up. Because if we're around our people, and if we're being reminded that no matter what happens in the legislature, no matter what happens in the courts, we're going to care for each other, then that then empowers people to move forward, even under the threats of extreme discrimination and violence.
Great. So we got several questions from audience members, and I want to try to get a couple of those in before we finish up. And one of those does relate to probably what is the most the issue where the polling is maybe the worst for trans advocates, and that is the question of sports and trans individuals competing in sports where they're being born a man may have an impact on their success, or the perception is that it could matter in terms of the outcome of that athletics. What happens with that conversation, both legally and then in the healthcare and advocacy spaces, to change that perspectives on that issue? Or is that just going to be one of the toughest battles because of the depth of perception about that issue. Chase, you want to get us going?
Well, I mean, so first of all, I think it's all been incredibly disingenuous. So I just want to say that right from the outset. You know, we had this big moment where everyone was, causing all this agita over the quote unquote end of women's sports and this idea that trans people were going to take over women's sports. But we lost a little bit of critical perspective. First of all, that was the exact rhetoric and discourse that we had heard about bathrooms. It was strategically morphed into sports. And frankly, they've already moved on to healthcare. So I don't think there is a genuine concern, obviously, about the future of women's sports coming from those who would situate the greatest threat to women's sports being the handful of trans people who still compete in sports despite unimaginable amounts of discrimination. So we have to sort of level set and be serious about the context. I think at the core of what is going on with respect to sports and a lot of this discourse is the fundamental refusal for people to recognize trans people for who we are. This idea that we are always inherently fraudulent and we pose a threat to others inherently. That is one of the reasons why the sports rhetoric became so successful, because it was able to situate our bodies as an inherent threat. We didn't have to do anything. Just being there was the problem, particularly for trans women and girls. And that trans misogyny then was able to be leveraged to legitimize other forms of intrusion and violence. That, by the way, didn't just hurt trans people. When you empower the state to start to scrutinize and regulate sex in this manner, what it does is it harms everyone. And the reality of sports, of course, is that most people playing women's and girls sports are cisgender women and girls. And the history of sex policing in sport is one that has always been used to scrutinize the bodies of Black and brown women and girls, cisgender women and girls mostly, from the global South. And now we're importing what was a previous international set of policies into our K through 12 system. So while people were using anti-trans rhetoric to set up this regime of surveillance, what ultimately is going to happen, and we've already seen the beginnings of this, is that it's going to harm all women and girls. It's going to enhance surveillance. And I think we're getting incredibly distracted by disingenuous arguments that are being pushed by very well-funded global organizations that have at their core the interest of controlling the bodies of LGBTQ people and all of us. They're the same people that are seeking to ban abortion, the same people that are seeking to ban contraception, and they're coming for no-fault divorce, and it's all connected. So I think part of what I want us to do is step outside of the discourse a little bit and say, why are we being so susceptible to this idea of this totally contrived threat of trans kids in sports? And we're really talking about kids.
Great, thank you. Dr. Herzig?
So piggybacking off of that, I think it's crazy that we're talking about kids and kids sports mainly, because it's like, I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old daughter, right? I'm like, and my brother, who's in the front audience, he's right there. But, you know, he has Leo, which is the same age as Autumn, and they play together. I mean, it's like, who cares that a kindergartner, an elementary, or intermediate school, that those kids are playing on the same team or whatnot? It's just like they're kids. I mean, when you get up to high school and college and stuff like that, where it's becoming a little bit more athletic, or, you know, like you're like, maybe that's what you're going for a career. You know, I really just kind of piggyback off Chase over there. So.
Great. Representative Turner.
Yeah, no, absolutely the same, right? I think it's, I don't know. I always think about it through the lens of like, we tell kids that they can be whatever they want, right? They can do whatever they want. And like, especially when we're talking about in the binary, right? We say like, we grow up often, like if you were socialized, right? Or socialized as a girl, right? Or in AFAB, right? Then folks are continuously saying like, you're just as good as any boy out there. You can beat them, right? And then we get to this place where we're like, oh, absolutely not, right? No sports together. I think that's kind of like wild. But ultimately, right, far beyond it, right, is really dissecting like what makes us think about that, right? What makes us think like this is the ground, right? Like that maybe like this is the one argument where they might have us, right? Like that's not it, right? Like it all feels like a very, very big smoke screen, right? Because like we are in full tilt, right, for an authoritarian rule, right? And when we sit here and we say, well, maybe this is it, right? Maybe this isn't part of just the absolute loss of bodily autonomy, right? Then we get lost in this space where we're trying to figure out like maybe like this is the thing where they're right on and everything else they're wrong on, when the thing is, right, like we are fighting for bodily autonomy. We are fighting for our communities to survive this. Sports are sports, right? They are ways for our youth to be able to learn leadership skills, to be in community with one another, right? Like one of the biggest tools of oppression is isolation. And if we do that in sports, and if we do that in prisons, right? Like it is essentially the same thing to keep people away from learning about themselves and the world around them, to keep them from building skills that really help them with the world around them, right? And so
All right, one last question. It also comes from the audience, and it harkens back to things that all of y'all have said previously. And the question is, what can we do at the local level, specifically in a place like Little Rock, to ensure basic protections for non-cisgender community members? Representative Turner, you want to get us going?
Yeah, I'd tell you the same thing I tell the folks in Oklahoma, right? Is that you build those resources within your community. You make sure that you've got, whether it is a meal train line, whether it is mutual aid, right, for utilities or surgery, right? I think we're at a time where folks feel so much quicker to give $20 to a very big organization and not and say like, oh, I'm a little worried about giving $5 to this GoFundMe right here for some folks that are my neighbors, right? Like we have to be willing to say like, and we have to, I guess, maybe, right, de-police, right, our hearts and our minds about what we are willing to get engaged with, about who is allowed services and who's able to get them those services, right? So I'd ask you, think twice, right, before you give a big check to a big political figurehead or whatever, right? And think about like, are there organizations on the ground? Are there individuals, right? Small grassroots organizations on the ground that are doing this work, right? That are helping take care of my neighbors right here in Little Rock, right? I'd ask you to help build those systems, right? And empower our community members to continue to show up, right? Because like the big thing, right, is that like visibility without protection is a target on someone's back, right? And so if we are going to ask our trans siblings to continue to go and be their own advocates at the legislature, then we have to be willing to show up with them, right? We have to be in community together. I think where we are at in allyship is that a lot of folks think that allyship is like the space that we carve out between the two of us for you to feel completely and fully yourselves. But the thing is that allyship has to go beyond just you and me, right? It has to be, well, how do you get to be this version of you, right? How do you get to be fully you everywhere? And how do I ensure that you get to be this version of you everywhere? At the legislature, at work, at the coffee shop down the street, right? Like everywhere. And that means that we've got to do a great deal of unlearning and also actively engaging at the same time, right? We are at a time where you can't sit out if you want to be an ally or more pointedly an accomplice in liberation. So you have to be willing to actively engage, and it is uncomfortable. Like there is literally no part of liberation or fighting the government that is going to be comfortable. As a politician, I absolutely am telling you this. And so I think that's one of the big things, right? Is that we have to be willing to engage. We have to be willing to let go of the things that we have learned about who gets access to what and who gives them access, right? So I think that's my advice.
Great. Dr. Herzig?
So community involvement is probably huge. Our allies are so vital here. I mean, even in the pharmacy, I see that, yeah, majority, probably 50% or greater is LGBTQ based, but the other 50% are my allies that show up. And so I just really appreciate them. You know, the key takeaways that I go to every like pre-professional or professional businesses or whatever is like, there's 4 keys that you can really do to show up and make sure you're doing preferred names, preferred pronouns, show your pride in some way. You know, I tell this at a doctor's office, like LGBTQ people are pros at finding that rainbow flag. It could be as big as a huge banner or as small as a lapel pin. We will find it. And we will know that it's a lot more comfortable to talk with you. And then finally, it's educate yourself. It's never the person in front of you, the person in the community to educate you. You should be the one that's reading. You should be the one asking and advocating. And luckily, there's a lot of people like us on stage that are like here to be able to, we don't mind educating, but especially for that person that's just came out of the closet or they're like 1 foot out of the closet, it's not their job to do the education. And so really it just kind of show up and be there for us and like really kind of go to the polls and vote. Please vote.
Great. Chase, closing thoughts.
Not much more to say other than, you know, so much happens at the local level. So much happens. So much of why we are where we are today is because people have neglected local organizing, district attorney organizing. Like when it comes to political organizing and voting, district attorneys, school boards, state legislatures, city councils, obviously this has such an impact on our lives, on what we can learn, what we can read, what we can do with our bodies and in our communities, how we form family relationships and what our communities can do when they're organizing. So being really responsive to the local is so critical.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Let's all give it up for these great panelists. Let me turn it over to Nate Coulter, our partner this evening, and I want to thank Nate for his standing up on book censorship, and we know a lot of those issues are about LGBTQ plus issues, and so thank you, Nate.
Thank you, and thank all three of you, Chase, Representative Turner, Dr. Herzig. Let's give them another big hand for their courage. I have a dear friend who lives in Oklahoma City, and I was texting him as the meeting started. He says, yes, I don't know her, but I've heard about her. I have a good friend who's had a conversation with her. I've got to have a conversation with her. So you have a fan who hasn't met you yet. CALS is delighted to have been had a small role in this sponsorship of this program. And I want to say just a word or two about why this is so important to us. And I kept hearing the term show up and allies and stand up. And I think that's what we're trying to do. And let me just tell you why it's important to me as the head of the largest public library in the state. Several years ago, there was a book by a woman named Susan Orlean. It was about the fire in the 80s in the LA library. It was called The Library Book. It was also about a lot of things that go on in libraries every day. But she had a passage that I'm going to share. Our minds and souls contain volumes inscribed by our experiences and emotions. Each individual's consciousness is a collection of memories we've cataloged and stored inside us, a private library of a life lived. Our public libraries are really a collection of the people who have been daring enough to put down in writing their collected experiences and stories. Some of them are nonfiction, some of them are fiction, but they all contain truth and express a lot of different experiences, and that is what the public library is here for. We don't exclude some people's experiences because some in the community don't want to recognize those experiences, don't want to recognize those stories, and don't want to recognize those people. So that's why at CALS, we're committed to representing all the community in all of our collections and supporting all of our community with resources like we're demonstrating here and programming that promotes the freedom to explore and be who you are, and that strives to support and respect you whatever you decide after that exploration. And let me just give two quick examples. One is in the newspaper a lot, or in the media. We are engaged in a fight to stand up for books that express the entire community's lived experience. There's a legislative enactment that is hostile to that. And the people who support that law have been fairly poorly veiling their motivation. It's another part of this targeting. And we are now set for a hearing on a preliminary injunction to try to stay that law on July 25th. There's a federal hearing. More at the grassroots level in the day-to-day, we are also sponsors of an event tomorrow night, the end of Pride Month, which I'm getting a lot of hate emails about. It's called Mass Queer Aid. It's a library-sponsored, solely sponsored by the library. It's not at the library. We didn't have a venue that was appropriate for it. But it's agitating a lot of people. We get a lot of hate mail about it. But I'm here to represent all of the community through the library, and I'm here to pledge that we'll continue to show up and stand up and do what we can to be with you and applaud your courage and your strength in trying to represent the parts of the community that are still so important to us. So thank you very much.
They, them, pronouns?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm from the 405. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think you and I actually might have a lot of friends in common. You know Shana Deitch? Yeah.